Imagine you are 10,000 feet above the Pacific, listening to a twin-engine Lockheed Electra as dawn thins the darkness below. You are Amelia Earhart, the woman newspapers called the Babe of the Sky, a pilot who had crossed barriers most people never dared approach. And on the morning of July 2nd, 1937, you are attempting what no woman had done before. Fly around the world near its equator. You have crossed continents, oceans, and weather that would intimidate seasoned aviators. And now, the largest stretch of open water lies beneath you. But as the hours pass, the static in your headset grows louder, and the terrible possibility hardens into certainty. You may be lost over Earth's largest ocean. This is not just the story of a missing plane. It is one of aviation history's longest mysteries. A disappearance that still grips the imagination decades later. How does the most famous female pilot of her era, a woman whose achievements were celebrated worldwide, vanish without leaving a confirmed wreck behind? How does Amelia Earhart disappear alongside her navigator Fred Noonan, somewhere between New Guinea and the tiny speck of Howland Island, and never return to explain what happened? To understand why this case became so legendary, you have to separate what the historical record supports from what remains theory or speculation. The documented core is extraordinary enough. Earhart was real. Her record-setting flights were real. Her final round-the-world attempt was real, and her last radio calls were real. Everything beyond that becomes a struggle between evidence and absence, between official logs, later investigations, sightings, and theories born from the missing aircraft. If a plane crashes, investigators expect debris, radio logs, fuel estimates, wreckage, and answers. But this case denied almost all of that, making the mystery grow for decades. Before the disappearance became legend, Amelia Earhart had become a symbol of modern courage, skill, and female independence in a world that treated those qualities as unusual in women. Born in Atchison, Kansas, in 1897, she came of age when aviation still felt new, unstable, dangerous, and almost mythic. She did not simply enter that world. She forced her way into it and became one of its defining public faces through talent, endurance, and a gift for turning risk into achievement. The historical record confirms that in 1928, she became the first woman to cross the Atlantic as a passenger, a feat that made her internationally famous overnight. But fame alone was never enough for her. She wanted to be known not as cargo, but as a pilot capable of doing what the best men in aviation had done. So, in 1932, she crossed the Atlantic alone, flying from Newfoundland to Ireland in a journey that secured her place among the greatest aviators of the era. That solo crossing was not a clean triumph. Contemporary accounts show the flight was dangerous, exhausting, and threatened by technical problems and brutal weather. Her aircraft suffered mechanical trouble. Ice accumulated, equipment misbehaved, and the route became a prolonged test of concentration, improvisation, and nerve. She survived it. And because she survived it, the world began to see her not just as a celebrity flyer, but as a pilot of real ability and resourcefulness. By the middle of the 1930s, she had become more than an aviator. She was a cultural force, an emblem of ambition, modernity, and fearlessness. That is part of why the disappearance struck so deeply. When ordinary people go missing, tragedy follows. But when icons vanish, tragedy expands into mythology almost immediately. By 1937, Earhart was preparing for the culminating challenge of her career: a flight around the world on a demanding equatorial route. This was not a symbolic hop from one famous city to another. It was a grueling long-distance project involving navigation, weather, maintenance, and endurance across many legs. If completed, The route would cover about 29,000 miles. A global marathon through places as varied as South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Her aircraft for this effort was a heavily modified Lockheed 10 Electra, a twin-engine plane altered to carry far more fuel than the standard passenger version. That modification mattered enormously, because over-water flight in the 1930s was as much a math problem as a test of courage, and fuel ruled everything. A normal aircraft could not improvise across oceanic legs of that scale. So the Electra was stripped, rebalanced, and fitted with enlarged fuel tanks for the long hauls ahead. By the time she reached Lae, New Guinea, she and Noonan had traveled about 22,000 miles, with about 7,000 still left. Fred Noonan, her navigator, was no afterthought. He was an experienced navigator with a strong maritime and aviation background, brought in for this demanding leg. Howland Island, their next target, was tiny, isolated, and hard to spot even in good conditions. A destination swallowed by an ocean vast enough to erase small errors. On the morning of July 2nd, 1937, Earhart and Noonan departed Lae and set out toward that nearly invisible target in one of the journey's most hazardous legs. The distance was about 2,556 miles, long enough to punish every miscalculation, delay, headwind, and radio misunderstanding. And almost from the beginning, conditions appear to have been worse than hoped, especially headwinds that slowed progress and ate through fuel reserves. Some later reconstructions and radio-related accounts suggest warnings about those winds were sent. But whether Earhart received or understood all of it remains uncertain. What is not uncertain is that communication during the flight became a problem. And the radio record from that morning is one of the most studied pieces of evidence in the case. As Earhart approached the vicinity of Howland Island, the Coast Guard cutter Itasca was waiting nearby to assist with radio communication and visual support. The plan, in simple terms, was for Earhart to use radio contact and navigation to locate Howland, while the ship tried to guide her in. But technical problems, frequency issues, transmission limits, and possible misunderstandings began to pile up. And that breakdown may have turned a difficult approach fatal. The surviving radio logs show that Itasca could hear Earhart, sometimes clearly, but she does not appear to have received everything the ship was sending back. That asymmetry is one of the case's most haunting elements. People on the ship were listening to a crisis unfold while unable to bridge the gap that might have saved the aircraft. At one point, the signal was reportedly strong enough that men on deck believed the plane might be close enough to appear overhead, but Howland Island remained out of sight. And Earhart's messages grew more urgent as time and fuel turned into desperation over open water. One of her most remembered transmissions reported that they must be near the ship, yet could not see it, could not see the island, and kept searching in worsening uncertainty. Her final confirmed messages include the now famous Line 157337, a navigational line that later became central to theories about where the aircraft went next. She also indicated that fuel was running low, a statement that has echoed for decades because it suggests the problem was no longer merely navigational, but existential. After that, the radio fell silent, and the historical record enters its great gap, the empty space from which later theories emerge. The most straightforward explanation, and the one many historians and investigators consider simplest, is the crash and sink theory. Under that view, Earhart and Noonan failed to locate Howland Island in time, ran low on fuel, and ultimately went down in the Pacific somewhere near their intended destination. This theory is supported by the brutal logic of overwater flight. A tiny island, bad weather, incomplete communication, fuel pressure, and no confirmed later survival evidence. Later analyses of winds, fuel burn, and flight conditions often point this way, suggesting the Electra may have exhausted its fuel before the island could be seen. If that happened, the aircraft would have entered one of the most unforgiving search environments on Earth, in waters deep enough to hide wreckage. That helps explain why even large searches failed. An aircraft descending into remote Pacific depths could remain hidden for decades, perhaps forever. And yet, the absence of discovered wreckage is exactly what kept other possibilities alive, especially the theory that Earhart did not sink immediately at sea. The most prominent alternative is the Nikumaroro theory, sometimes called the castaway theory, and it has remained one of the most serious competing explanations. Nikumaroro, then known as Gardner Island, lies along the line Earhart referenced in her final messages, making it a plausible alternate destination. The theory proposes that instead of crashing into deep ocean near Howland, Earhart and Noonan may have flown onward and landed on a reef near Nikumaroro. Under favorable tide conditions, a reef flat could, in theory, have offered a narrow but possible emergency landing surface for a skilled pilot under extreme pressure. If that happened, the story changes from instant disappearance into a survival struggle on a remote coral atoll far from where rescuers were looking. Supporters of this theory point to later evidence, none definitive alone, but together strong enough to keep the idea alive in serious discussion. One major point involves discoveries made on the island years later, including signs of a campsite, possible navigational objects, and partial human remains. In 1940, British colonial officer Gerald Gallagher reported bones and associated items found on Nikumaroro, including what appeared to be part of a sextant box. Those bones were examined at the time by Dr. David Hoodless, who concluded they likely belonged to a male, an assessment long seen as damaging to the Earhart connection. But the bones themselves were later lost, and that loss created another vacuum, because later researchers had to work from measurements and notes, decades afterward. Some modern analysts argued the recorded measurements fit a woman of Earhart's build better than a stocky man. That does not prove the bones were hers. But it keeps the Nikumaroro theory alive, because the original conclusion cannot now be retested with the missing skeleton. Other details also feed the castaway scenario, including reported artifacts, survival evidence, and later interpretations of distress calls allegedly heard after the disappearance. Those post-loss radio signals are heavily debated, but some researchers argue at least some could only have been sent if the Electra remained intact and temporarily dry after landing. This is where the story becomes more unsettling. If the radio calls were genuine, Earhart may not have died that day, but survived for some time awaiting rescue. One of the most frequently cited reports comes from a teenager in Florida who claimed she heard a woman she believed was Amelia over the radio, frightened and exhausted. Whether that account was a real reception, a misunderstanding, or later distortion remains disputed. And it must be labeled unconfirmed, however haunting it sounds. Still, the very existence of such reports adds emotional force to the Nikumaroro theory, because it imagines not a swift end, but prolonged hope and abandonment. And then, there are the coconut crabs, which may sound grotesque until one learns these large land crabs are real scavengers on Pacific islands. Researchers who support the castaway theory have suggested that crab scavenging could explain why only partial remains or scattered evidence survived on the island. That idea is horrific, but it is also grounded in ecological reality, which is why it remains part of serious discussion around Nikumaroro. The Marshall Islands theory takes the story in a very different direction, away from navigation error and survival struggle into intelligence missions, wartime politics, and alleged capture by Japan. Under this theory, Earhart was not simply a civilian pilot lost on a pioneering flight, but was connected in some way to American reconnaissance interests in the Pacific. Some versions claim She flew into or near Japanese-controlled territory, crashed or landed in the Marshall Islands, and was then captured by Japanese authorities along with Noonan. This theory has been sustained by later witness claims. Stories from the Marshall Islands and suspicions that a rescue narrative concealed a darker geopolitical reality. But this must be labeled clearly as theory, not as documented fact, because no archival record confirms that Earhart was acting as a spy or that Japan captured her alive. Over the years, the Marshall Islands theory also expanded into even more dramatic claims, including claims that Earhart survived the war under another identity in the United States. One of the best-known claims said that she returned and lived as a woman named Irene Bolam, a theory so forcefully rejected that Bolam pursued legal action over it. A famous photograph once seemed to revive the capture story, when some believed it showed Earhart and Noonan in the Marshall Islands after the disappearance. But that supposed breakthrough was later undermined when evidence showed the image had appeared in print before Earhart's final flight. That debunking mattered, because it showed how badly people wanted a dramatic answer, and how easily weak evidence could be elevated by a legendary disappearance. Then, at the far edge of speculation, the mystery enters territory so unproven that it requires distance, alien abduction, time anomalies, and other fantastical explanations. These theories exist because total disappearance invites extremes, and because 80 years without a confirmed wreck can make implausible ideas feel tempting. But they remain fringe speculation, unsupported by credible historical evidence, and useful mainly as a measure of how deeply this case entered modern myth. So where does that leave us? With one of history's most famous unsolved disappearances, and several competing explanations that do not carry equal weight. The documented record strongly supports the reality of the flight. The communication breakdown, mounting urgency near Howland Island, and the disappearance itself. The crash and sink explanation remains the cleanest solution, because it requires the fewest assumptions beyond the known difficulties of that final leg. The Nikumaroro theory remains the most compelling survival alternative, tied to a real location, a plausible route, and physical clues that, while unresolved, are real. The Marshall Islands theory remains possible only in the broadest sense, but it is unproven and too dependent on later testimony to rise above speculation. And the more extravagant theories survive mostly because open mystery attracts every kind of explanation the imagination can generate. Yet, perhaps the most powerful part of this story is that Amelia Earhart's legacy does not depend on which ending proves true, if any ever is. She remains a towering figure because of how she lived, because she treated the sky not as a limit, but as a place to be entered, tested, crossed, and turned into possibility. Whether her final moments came over deep Pacific water or on a remote reef under an empty sky, history can still state what she had already accomplished before that final loss. She had already changed aviation, already broken barriers, shown that modern exploration belonged to women no less than men, and become part of world history. That is why the mystery endures with such force. Not only because the ending is missing, but because the person at its center mattered so much before she disappeared. Until confirmed Lockheed wreckage is tied to the Electra, or a definitive chain of evidence closes the case, Amelia Earhart will remain suspended between record and legend, forever grounded in real history, and forever lifted by the unanswered question of what happened over the Pacific.